household names in college football in a conference that year in and year out are going to be good. You come in every season, you think, okay, this guy's going to be, we know this guy's going to be a big name. But who are the potential breakout stars? Guys going into this season where you're thinking, all right, maybe they'll, be good. And by the end of it, you're going, boy, that's one of the best players in the conference. There are three in the Pac-12 that could make an impact on a national scale, according to 24/7 Sports. We'll get to those three, two in the Pac-12 North and one in the Pac-12 South. Plus, we continue our coverage of NFL draft prospects for guys coming out of the Pac-12. Today, we're looking at UCLA tight end Greg Dolcich here on Locked On Pac-12. Here we go.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host for today, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and a lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. I host Locked On Ducks, and here I am hosting today's episode of Locked On Pac-12. Cindy is out and about, so you're all just stuck with me today, but that's okay because we have plenty to get to here on the show. Let's hop right in. So 24/7 Sports came out with a list of 22 players for the year 2020-22. See how clever they are? Yeah, okay, anyway. So I just thought it was weird. Like, why not do 25? I don't know. So they came out with 22 players nationally who they think could pop this year, right? Players that you've maybe heard of, seen here and there, but really they're expected to be, kind of breakout stars. And there were 3 Pac-12 players on that list, which is always a good thing to see from a conference perspective because there are not that many teams or players that get that much national attention right now because the conference for the last couple of years has just been really, really down with football. So it's always good to see guys getting the sort of recognition that is not very easy to come by for guys playing out here on the West Coast. By the way, for those of you watching on YouTube, yes, this is a Disney castle on my shirt. I actually bought it at Disneyland, but it's the Disney World castle. I didn't realize that till afterwards, but that's okay. The message gets across. So first player that we're going to look at today, coming in at number 22 of 22 players on this list, is the defensive end for Washington and new head coach Kalyn Deboer. Zion, I hope I'm not going to butcher this, Tupuola-Fetui. We're just going to go with Zion. That's just going to be a little bit simpler. And he's a guy who might be kind of a lone bright spot for Washington on the defensive side of the ball. They're losing Trent McDuffie. They don't have, any other big-time high-caliber players. They lose Sam Taimani to Oregon in the offseason via the transfer portal. He goes down I-5 and is now playing in Eugene. So this is a guy in Fatoui who's going to have to step up because they're just going to miss some production, I think, on the defensive side of the ball without Taimani being there. So it's something they're going to have to account for. And the interesting thing about him, he was only a 3-star recruit, but he has actually turned into a really, really nice player up there for the Dogs. In 2020, which, if we recall, was not a full college football season, he had 7 sacks. 7 sacks that year. I don't even remember how many games Washington played because everybody played a different number of games, and it was all disaster. And I'm glad that's in the past, and I know you are as well. 7 sacks in 2020. That would be an impressive stat in a regular season, but in a shortened season, that was some really, really quality production. Now, unfortunately for him, he missed a lot of the 2021 college football season because he had a knee injury. So he has opted to come back for a 5th year of college football. He was class of 2018, I believe, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. There we go. I'm just doing math out loud for you here on the show. But he was just a 3-star guy, kind of like an average rated 3-star recruit who was developed into a really quality football player for the Huskies. And they're in a state where they're kind of rebuilding, right? They don't have a long-term solution at quarterback. Dylan Morris is not it. They have some other talented guys on the roster, but they haven't worked their way in yet. Kalyn Deboer has a big-time job to do up there. Though the defense has been fine the last couple of years, he has more work to do on the offensive side of the ball, which is good because he's an offensive coach. And he was going to have Jake Haener come with him from Fresno State, and then he didn't. So he's going to have to make do with the quarterbacks that are up there in that room. But I just don't think Dylan Morris is a guy who's going to keep you competitive in the Pac-12 or any Power 5 conference at this point, unless he takes a big step forward, which maybe he does. But when you're trying to figure out that side of the ball so dramatically, you're looking for guys who are returning, who are experienced and are productive players on both sides, who are going to, kind of be able to help you out and help ease the transition for a new coach in that sense. So I don't have very high expectations for Washington this year. I think they'll be, probably one of the lower teams in the Pac-12 North. Maybe they could win. I feel like 7 games is probably their ceiling on the year, but overall, it's a roster who is just looking for productive players. But Zion Tupuoloa-Fetui is definitely a guy who could provide that for the Huskies this year up in Seattle. He's 6'4", 260 pounds. And this is going to be his 5th year of college football. So he's a guy who's been in the weight room a lot. This is a guy who has been on the field a lot. So there's not going to be a lot that he hasn't seen before. And if he's able to stay healthy, he could be kind of one of the anchor pieces, I think, for that Washington defense now that Trent McDuffie, the cornerback, is leaving, going to the NFL. We, of course, have talked about him here on the show and his NFL draft prospects. I'll tell you about Gary Bryant, the junior wide receiver, or Gary Bryant Jr., the wide receiver for USC. But first, I want to tell you about a Built Bar. So this is the time of year that everyone's pretty much given up on their New Year's resolutions. But if you had one about eating better, or you just want to start eating better, Built Bar is a great way to do that. It tastes as good, if not better, than a candy bar. I think they taste better than most candy bars that I've had. I think the only ones on top would be maybe a Snickers. That's probably about it. They're fantastic. They only have 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein, 130 calories. I'm a huge golfer. I load these things up in my golf bag so that I can get some sustained nutrition on the course. The protein keeps me full and going out there. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. So Gary Bryant Jr. is going to be one of the primary pass catchers this year for USC and first-year head coach Lincoln Riley. And there's a void on the outside. There's a void for USC out there because you don't have Drake London anymore. And for the last couple of years, I've talked about how Drake London is not always the flashiest guy per se, but he's just productive. That's just what he is. And he has been the best offensive player consistently for USC over the last couple of years. Sure, you could argue Kedon Slovis and the quarterbacks, Jackson Dart from this past year. You could argue that they've been, more important, obviously, because they're quarterbacks. But the guy who was there the entire time and making those quarterbacks better has been Drake London. So now, anytime you lose a player like that, Oregon's having the same questions right now on defense. Kayvon Thibodeau's gone. He's going in the top 10 of the NFL draft. When you lose a player of that caliber, how are you going to replace him? Because it leaves a void, in the locker room, but just from a production standpoint, you have to come up with those yards and touchdowns and receptions somewhere. And Gary Bryant Jr. seems like a guy who's poised to do that. He clocked in on 24/7's top 22 list of players likely to break out this year in college football at number 16. And last year, he had 579 yards and 7 touchdowns. That was with Drake London being there, who did miss time at the end of the year because he got injured. He's expected to be okay and still be the sort of wide receiver that he is heralded as going to the NFL. But Bryant Jr. now has a lot of things going for him at USC. Number one, there's an opportunity to showcase his skills. Number two, he showed a season ago that he's capable of being a good wide receiver in the Pac-12 Conference. So he already is that, right? But now he has the opportunity to make a jump. And, Drake London leaving is probably the biggest reason why 24/7 Sports put him on this list, because they're looking around going, well, he's kind of the top returning pass catcher for USC. But then the other thing he's got going for him is now Lincoln Riley is his head coach and Caleb Williams is going to be his quarterback. Lincoln Riley, one of the smartest offensive minds in college football, probably of the last 20 years. I mean, no one scores points like he does. And the defense for USC has got a long ways to go. They need some offensive line help as well. But one thing, even as Clay Helton started to struggle towards the end of his tenure, USC was always able to do. They were able to bring in some sweet wide receivers. They had Michael Pittman, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Drake London. Like, these have been real dudes on the outside catching passes from whoever was playing quarterback for USC in those jerseys that haven't changed literally in my entire lifetime pretty much. So I think having Lincoln Riley there is great. Having Caleb Williams there is great. And it's It's not that Keaton Slovis wasn't good. I liked Jackson Dart a lot. Jackson Dart going to Ole Miss, I think he will thrive, absolutely thrive there with Lane Kiffin, who is also a very sharp offensive mind in college football and knows how to score a few points. He's done it a time or 50 on Saturdays in the fall. But Lincoln Riley there is the coach. Caleb Williams, who's going to be a top pick in the NFL draft, is going to be his quarterback. And the opportunity here for Gary Bryant Jr., I think, is pretty significant because he has the opportunity, should he decide to do this, and I believe I'm going to look up what year it is because I want to be sure, but he could stay at USC for a couple years, right, and start to develop a really high level chemistry with Caleb Williams. I don't think he's projecting right now as an NFL guy, so he could be done after this season. He's a junior, but I would suspect he's someone who, if he wants to maximize his draft stock one day, would want to have two really productive seasons. So being there with Caleb Williams, who a lot of teams are going to be looking at as a top 5 pick in the 2023 or 2024, I think, NFL draft. I don't know. All the years are blending together. Whenever Caleb Williams is coming out, then that is when that's when teams are going to be taking him. They will be looking at him as a top 5 pick. So you have that sort of guy throwing you the ball. I think that's an opportunity for Gary Bryant Jr. to really pop. The other thing is Caleb Williams from Oklahoma brought Lincoln Riley with him, a couple other players. One of them is a guy by the name of Mario Williams, who is a wide receiver. Now, you may be thinking, well, if there's already, some ingrained chemistry between those two, isn't that going to limit Bryant's upside? I don't think that's the case because, number one, when you look at the Oklahoma offenses in the last several years, they haven't had any problems getting a number of wide receivers, big-time targets, and big-time stats because they're going to score a lot of points. I don't know how many games they'll win this year. I don't think it'll be, a 10, 11 win season for USC, but it could, and I think should very well be a 7, 8, maybe even 9 win year for the Trojans down in LA. And they're going to score a lot of points to do that. So there will be plenty of touches to go around, right? And having Mario Williams there, who's already a big-time threat in college football, he's going to garner a lot of attention. I think that opens up the field a lot for Gary Bryant Jr. I think that's going to allow him to avoid double teams and bracketed coverage and getting all the attention or having the other team's best corner follow you. I think he might have gotten that sort of treatment had Mario Williams not come with Caleb Williams from Oklahoma. I don't believe there's any relation there, but I could totally be wrong. I don't think there is, though. Anyway, so I think that those are a lot of really good things, right? You've got a new offensive-minded head coach. You've got a future top 5 pick at quarterback. You've got a good wide receiver on the other side of you. And frankly, you're also in a conference where there are not that many elite defensive backs right now. And a couple of them are going to the NFL this year. So I think there's going to be some transition in the secondary across the conference. Oregon's certainly going to have that, but Washington's losing Trent McDuffie. Like they're just going to be some exploitable defense this year. And I think 24/7 was smart to put him on this list because I think Gary Bryant could have a big, big year for the Trojans. He might be the number 2 receiver to Mario Williams statistically when it's all said and done, but I still think that he could have over 1,000 yards and maybe even come up on double-digit touchdowns because they're going to have a lot of weapons. They're going to have a really smart offensive coach with a great quarterback, and that's the foundation for scoring a lot of points, and I think he can capitalize on that as a pass catcher. Speaking of USC, by the way, the running back that they recently acquired this offseason, the transfer portal, Travis Dye, coming from my beloved Oregon Ducks, has left a little bit of a void up in Eugene. And right in front of Gary Bryant on 24/7's list of the 22 players most likely to break out, clocking in at number 15, is Byron Cardwell Jr. Now, this is an interesting guy to talk about in this particular context. And I think he belongs on this list, but I would almost put a little bit of an asterisk there for a few reasons. So for those of you who don't know, he was the number 3 running back last year behind C.J. Verdell and Travis Dye coming into the season. Then after 4 games, C.J. Verdell injured his leg or foot against Stanford and then was out for the year. And so then Travis Dye was the number 1 back. He did exceptionally well. Byron Cardwell was the number 2. And he did exceptionally well, averaging almost 7 yards a carry, scoring some touchdowns. and he showed some explosiveness and, a nice kind of jitterbug nature to him to make guys miss in space. He showed a lot of promise. The thing about him, though, is I think Oregon's running back room, which I follow very closely, I host Locked On Ducks, is more crowded than people really think. Coming into this year, the expectation is that amongst fans and I think media people as well, is that Byron Cardwell will be the number one. And that's totally understandable. He's the most productive running back and the most experienced one returning for the Ducks this year, even though they don't have a lot of production or experience coming back in that room. He's the most veteran guy of the group. But there's suddenly some talented guys there. Now, they're a little thin at the position. That's why they added the Western Kentucky transfer, Noah Whittington. He adds some much-needed depth there, and he played this past season and was a nice player out there on the eastern part of the country for the Hilltoppers. But you have Noah Whittington. You have Sean Dollars as well. And from a physical gifts standpoint, Sean Dollars is the most gifted running back that Oregon has on this roster right now. And so I think Dan Lanning and the running backs coach Carlos Locklin are going to have a little bit of a decision to make when it comes to, is this going to be running back by committee, or do we want Cardwell to be the number one bell cow back? But I don't think that Cardwell has won the job yet. I think that's the expectation. And, I understand why 24/7 has him on this list, because if he is the number one guy, yeah, he could be very good. But I would just keep your eye on Sean Dollars, because he could take away a lot of carries from Cardwell. Even if Byron Cardwell Jr. does win the running back job and he is named the starter and gets those sorts of touches, I think Sean Dollars could get a lot of them, because he's an explosive guy. And then you also have Seven McGee, who's now a hybrid running back wide receiver player. He could get a lot of touches as well on fly sweeps. So I think Cardwell has the physical talent and gifts as a running back to be a breakout player. It's just a matter of whether or not the touches are going to be there because of the makeup of Oregon's roster right now. But he's got a great offensive line. There's no doubt about that. I think that either Oregon or Utah, probably I would lean the Ducks. Maybe I'm biased there. Hop in the comments if you think I'm wrong. But I think Oregon has the best returning offensive line. They've got a lot of experience. They only lost George Moore IV from a season ago, and they probably had the best O-line in the conference last year as well. So that is certainly an advantage for Cardwell. He'll have the potential to put up those sorts of numbers that make him into, the sort of breakout player that a lot of people think he could end up becoming for Dan Lanning in his first year. But I would just be wary putting him on. Like I would have put Gary Bryant above Byron Cardwell on this list. We're continuing our coverage of Pac-12 NFL draft prospects, and Greg Dolcich is up next. But first, I want to tell you about Bet Online, your number one source for all your sports betting needs and stats and info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. Bet Online is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet Online, where the game starts. So Greg Dolcich is wrapping up this episode of Locked On Ducks. For those of you listening, Spencer McLaughlin, normal co-host of the show, filling in for Cindy Robinson, who is all sorts of busy today. So you just get me, but that's all right. 6'4", 250 pounds is Dolcich with a 4.69 40-yard dash. He was a 2021 first-team All-Pac-12 performer. No surprise there. Anyone who watched the conference this past year, he had a huge game against LSU in that early season upset and the biggest of Chip Kelly's tenure with the Bruins by far. He had that big, long touchdown run, a couple other big plays. He torched USC in that rivalry game down in the Coliseum as well. But this past year, he had 725 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns. Nice even numbers there. 42 receptions. Would have been better if it was 40. Imagine 40, 725, and 5. Everything a multiple of 5. Boy, that would have been really nice. But the biggest thing about him is his big play potential as a tight end. He averaged just over 17 yards per catch this past season, which is a massive, massive number. That was second in the nation amongst tight ends. So he has got that sort of big play potential. When you get him the ball in space, he's going to make a play. He'll run over a corner or a safety. He uses the stiff arm well, but he's agile enough to have those sorts of yak numbers. He's not getting them by accident. Now, part of it is certainly that Chip Kelly's a smart offensive mind, knows how to get his guys the ball in space. But once you get the ball there, you have to do a lot of the work yourself. And Dolcich definitely knows how to do that. He was, kind of a security blanket, a go-to for Dorian Thompson-Robinson over the last couple of years, almost to a fault sometimes, where he would stare him down. Kind of him and Kyle Phillips were his top two options. And Dolcich was very, very reliable this past year, and definitely merited being a first-team All-Pac-12 performer. But, something I didn't know about Greg Dolcich, he actually walked on to UCLA. He was a 3-star recruit, but they didn't have a scholarship for him. He walked on, he redshirted, and then in 2020, he was actually awarded a scholarship. That says a lot about his work ethic, that he was willing to be on the team. He was a 3-star recruit, so he could have gotten a scholarship somewhere else, but he wanted to show that he was, Power 5 capable, which he clearly is, and he's going to get drafted in the NFL. And I think that sort of story about him is a good thing, a really, really good thing. But it would be good for anyone, right? Because it shows a great work ethic, commitment, and love of the game. But especially for him, because he does have some things he needs to work on. When you read the scouting reports on Greg Dolcich, he has to become a better blocker because he is not prolific at that right now. He's, basically just a wide receiver who lines up at tight end. Now, he's big enough, 6'4" and about 245, 250. That's why he plays tight end, and that's definitely going to be the position he plays in the pros. But that's something that he has to get better at, and he'll never become an elite blocker. But if he wants to become a starter in the NFL and become a contributor on a pro football team, then he has to be able to improve in that area. But that work ethic that I was talking about, you go from a 3-star recruit to a walk-on to a scholarship guy who now projects, I think, as a third or fourth round draft pick based on what I've, just watched from him and read about him as well. He's never going to be an elite blocker, right? It's just not, it's like a basketball recruit who's offensively minded and struggles on defense. You can coach him up and work him to a spot where he's capable on defense and he's, solid and can hold his own, but you're just never going to be elite. It's a mindset thing. And Dolcich is just an offensive minded player. I think that's why he was such a great fit with Chip Kelly at UCLA and why he put up such great numbers as a pass catcher. And, I mentioned earlier how he's sort of just like a big wide receiver who lines up at tight end. I think that's something that works in his favor in one sense and against him in another. It works against him in that he's not a great run or pass blocker, so that's a little bit of a knock on his resume and his profile as an NFL draft prospect. But it also works in his favor because he's a guy who offensive coordinators in the league, I think, can get creative with. You can line him up, on the end of the line. You can line him up in the slot. You could line him up out wide if you want. He needs to be a little bit crisper with his route running. He doesn't have elite athleticism, but it's definitely above average for a guy of his size, and it's going to allow him to make plays in space. So I think if he gets to the right situation, he could succeed. And he reminds me a lot of an Oregon tight end from the recent past by the name of Pharaoh Brown, who would have played in a national championship game that 2014-15 year with Marcus Mariota if he hadn't gotten hurt. But unfortunately, he did. And he's been able to come back from that injury. He's played the last couple seasons with the Texans, and he's been a solid contributor, right? He's not, some all-pro or Pro Bowl caliber tight end, but you watch him and he'll make a couple plays a game and he'll catch the ball in space and make a run down the sideline, make a guy miss, show the speed, maybe find some room up the seam in the middle of the field. I think Dolcich can definitely be that sort of player. And when you look at him, there are some similarities there. And so I think if Pharaoh Brown can carve out a role for himself in the NFL, I think Greg Dolcich can absolutely do the same. Again, I think it's a third or fourth round draft pick for him, and any team that gets him, you have to work on his blocking a little bit, but from a pass catching perspective, he's got just about all the tools in the bag. I appreciate everyone listening. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for liking and subscribing wherever you're listening to and or watching the show right now. And thanks for staying locked on